Well, about 80% of grade 3 pupils in South Africa cannot read for meaning in any language. That's according to the latest 2030 reading panel report. The study also finds that by grade 6, almost 70% of learners are still reading below their grade level in either English or Afrikaans. Civil society has criticized government's lack of a national reading plan. Let's unpack some of the findings of the study with the head of research and development at Funda Wande, that's Sihle Nontshokweni-Bikitsha. She joins us live this afternoon. Sihle, it's great to talk to you, and what an important story this is. By grade 3 and even by grade 6, to be reading below the grade level in either language, English or in Afrikaans. That's devastating because it impacts every other subject.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so wonderful to be joining you to talk about this very crucial subject. And I think if you think of it, if they can't read in grade 3 at that particular phase, it means when children are changing from mother tongue based education into English in grade 4, what's actually about to happen is that for about a good 9 months, they're learning how to speak a language instead of being able to actually learn how to grasp the necessary material and building blocks that they have to build on to be able to have a strong foundation phase of learning. And so you have all these learning losses that are, one, attached to the capacity to grasp because of questions of material strength, right? The system itself, the history that we carry from our past and the present. But also within the system itself, there's all of these dropouts that are happening that really causes children to be in a disadvantaged position to really be able to have a successful education life, both in the foundation phase, but also right up until their NSC exams and their matric exams. Really, you're setting them up to not be able to succeed in the long run.
So what are some of the solutions here? I don't imagine that we can talk about a solution, right? So what are some of the solutions here? Do we need more schools to do first language instruction? Is that possibly an answer as we build up to the matric years?
Absolutely, Mish. I think what we've been thinking about at Funda Wande, and part of the work that we're doing, is really being able to test interventions and start to test what are the things that are actually working, one, when you pilot in different systems and in different contexts, and when do you begin to see some results. Where we're seeing very strong results in particular is one with coaching assistants. So this is what we know across South Africa, across different studies, that when teachers have coaching assistants and there's actual effective and intentional training and support for teachers, that they're in a much more better position to deliver materials effectively in ways that we start to see literacy gains. One of the key things that we started testing in Limpopo was teaching assistants, right? So when you have teaching assistants there, especially in a context of overcrowded classrooms, what you start seeing is that teachers then are able to give children the necessary attention, but also be able to provide the material in ways that are consistent with what is being measured ultimately. And so I think it's a variety of matters. One, language does matter in education. It will always matter because what you understand is part of what you bring in from your context itself. And I think this is why we heard from the SONA that now we're looking into bilingual education as well, as part of what we're integrating into the system to say, don't let kids come into the class and they leave all their language repertoires and everything else that they use in their home and pretend as if that is not a legible aspect of their learning within the classroom. That the classroom is not an isolated space, but it's interconnected across the different spaces of who they are and what they bring. And if we say that is rich too, and it's part of a legible fluency of how you learn, that we can start being able to see some kind of gains within the literacy space.
Yeah, because otherwise pupils are coming into grade 1 essentially blind. They're almost coming into grade 1, starting to learn how to read without any of the basic building blocks of English being your first language.
Absolutely. And I mean, what we know is that majority of African children in particular have significantly less books in their home environment. And that's definitely part of a historical context. It has to do with the cost of books and also even just the capacity to attend, right, early childhood development centers where a lot of children start gaining some of those essential building block skills. And so they're starting to learn almost in some way for the very first time in grade R or grade 1 itself. And if you suddenly are entering into that space and nothing that you come from home with matters, you haven't necessarily engaged with sound and word and reading and being able to make sense of that, the book almost becomes a thing that you just look at and then you stop. right? So I think that disengagement that happens where a child is only a symbol in the class, as opposed to being an engaged participant that is interested, that is curious. And I think part of the work that we are doing is thinking about how do you engage children in a real and meaningful way that says you belong in the classroom, you have something to learn, and you have the capacity to learn. And it's not this deficit model of how children enter into the classroom and the African context as it's been described for such a long time, being repeated because of the fact that there's not enough meaningful interventions into some of those historical contexts and the continued mismanagement within the education system.
Yeah, or else we have a situation, and I think, anyone who's watching who's taking care of a child or perhaps has a child that's now going through the various stages of young adulthood, if children struggle so much, they eventually get to the extent where they just lose interest and stop trying.
Of course. I mean, just think about it, even yourself, right? Like when you feel like when your ability to think of yourself and your capacity to be able to learn is constrained and has almost been oppressed on, you don't try, because then your assumption is it doesn't matter what I do, there's no output. And I think when that integration between the person themselves and the engagement with the material is actually disintegrated, what you have is a lot of discouraged children. And that's what you see when kids move out of the foundation phase into secondary learning, why we have such a significant dropout rate in grade 9, because the assumption is it doesn't really matter whether I become educated or not. Ultimately, at the end, what does it mean for me, right? Like, what does it mean in terms of my access to higher education? What does it mean in terms of my economic prospects? Will I be able to get a job from it? And if you're seeing the people around you who have gone further in their education being back in the very same environment, what it's saying is education doesn't matter, which we know is not true, because the likelihood of you being able to have employment and economic prospects in the long run truly is based on the quality of your education, especially in our context.
Yeah. I mean, one of the points I have in front of me here is that reading and learning can't begin and end in the classroom. You've already talked about how many books poorer communities have in their households. 40% of households that were surveyed, in fact, said that they had no books in their home. And it's difficult, right? As a working parent, perhaps even as a working single parent, to leave home early, to get home late at night, to try and sit with your children and to actually encourage reading. But we have to find a way.
We absolutely have to. And reading is a practice, it's a culture, right? So if children see that as something that is done within the environment and the context that I'm in, then it's something that is almost part of what you do within that context. When we look at the Pearls research, you can see a very direct link around the children who do perform better and actually the number of books that they have in their home. We haven't even begun to discuss the actual content of the books. Just having books in the home itself becomes resemblant of a probability of how well this child is going to do as they grow older. But also it's about storytelling, right? And I think part of this is being able to connect children to the world of stories itself within the home. And I understand parents are tired, but just thinking about within your own context, what can you use to really be able to engage a child and thinking about some of the themes that they're going to be learning in the home? If you're cooking, right? Like milliliters, right? The size of things, distance, all of those things, concepts that they now have to engage in. How do you take the context that you're in and start having them understand that it's not removed from themselves? And I think that's the danger that's happened for so long. The sense that what is happening in the classroom is not what is part of my world, especially for the African child, which is really where we start seeing the lower results, right? Like if you look at the Pearls data, especially children who are learning in their mother tongue, speaking either English or Afrikaans and being taught in those languages, what you're seeing is much higher results, even though they're still lower than the average results compared to some countries. But you start seeing much lower results with Zulu, Spedi-speaking children. And I think part of it, it's this disintegration between what I talk about on the playground and versus when I sit in the class, the book is something that is removed from my context.
Would you say, Sihle, that it's absolutely not an overstatement to say that reading is probably the single most important key to education?
I think 100%. I think absolutely. Because so if we're thinking about literacy as a practice itself, right? Reading, writing, all of those are connected because it's what you read that you're able to ultimately write, right? And so I think if you can't read, what it means is that every other subject that you try and build upon you really already are entering into it with a disadvantage.
Yeah.
So without being able to read and be able to actually think and critically think, not just routinely, like almost like a route learning style of having to say what's on the page, you're really incredibly disadvantaged from being able to build a meaningful life. One, I think actually a meaningful life where you're able to earn and build and create and not be stuck in a cycle of poverty in your future.
So incredibly worrying from this report. Without urgent reforms, full literacy could take 86 years to achieve. So what are these urgent reforms?
I mean, I think some of the most urgent reforms, one is us thinking about the qualification of teachers within the country, right? So how are we thinking about the training of teachers in a way that says, this is where the gaps are. How are teachers being trained? One, within higher education institutions in terms of language, in terms of content, in ways that ensure that those gaps are met. So one of the tests that we're finding is some of teacher knowledge in itself is also almost in question in different parts of it. And so I think one is the quality of teacher training. Two, learning and teaching support materials, ensuring that it's effective in terms of how you're able to train it. But I also think in a larger system way, being able to say to everybody, it is our shared responsibility that our children are able to read. And so the home context matters, the school matters, and also government as a whole. And I think ensuring that the resources are actually adequately allocated to where they are needed the most with the most amount of urgencies. And I don't think that should take us 80 years. It's too far an injustice. That's about 10 generations of the same cycle of poverty then we'd be looking at. And then we're talking about social security as the only way of being able to ensure that people have anything, because we haven't actually sufficiently invested in the development of minds that become innovative, critical thinking, and that are going to lead this country to where it needs to go.
Yeah.